tried to share my screen.
Okay.
And it is visible?
Yes.
All right. Then it's about time to return to ancient Greek epic. And so we will. Determined to the utmost to return home to Ithaca, Odysseus consults the deceased Theban seer Tiresias in the netherworld. His advice constitutes an algorithmic decision tree. In the translation, here under number 2 on the handout, the nodes of the tree, some already passed, some still ahead at this point in the story, are printed in boldface. The individual nodes are all but one presented as focalized from Odysseus' preferences. He had already chosen to wish for his return home and to save as many lives as he can. With regard to the journey ahead, he will focus on his return and choose to leave the cows unharmed. If he cannot save his crew, he will still choose to survive alone and, given the opportunity, to kill his wife's suitors. He will appease Poseidon if that means that there will be a fair chance for him to reach old age in prosperity, surrounded by his near and dear ones. Despite his infallible knowledge, Tiresias' algorithm still has to rely on Odysseus' assumed preferences to formulate a prediction for the future. It is tempting to interpret his words as predicting Odysseus' safe return and his successful vengeance on the suitors. But in Tiresias' decision tree, every choice, alternatively, ends in death. At this point in the narrative, the happy end of our Odyssey is as uncertain as is Odysseus' appeasement of Poseidon and his reaching old age, both, of course, disputed in what remains of the epic cycle. The seer's boost of cognitive abilities, including his knowledge of Odysseus' identity, preferences, and questions, was blood-induced, as became clear in the lines that immediately preceding the first citation. Here I present them under number 3. It was equally facilitated since Tiresias was dead, and to a degree, virtual and elusive for Odysseus in their encounter. The latter had to carefully pay attention now that he had dared to consult the deceased, but he also seized the opportunity to exploit the possibilities resulting from this endeavor, as we will see below. In this paper, I argue that a formative approach to students' acquisition of knowledge and skills in the modern 21st century viral environment somewhat resembles the artificial boost of human cognitive abilities experienced in Homer's netherworld. Formative assessment as a teaching and a learning method equally requires and encourages the learner to be brave, proactive, and critical. In times of COVID-19, teachers and students have to resort to digital materials and resources more than before the outbreak of the global pandemic. Publishers provide wider open access to their publications, and scholars record and share considerably more presentations, performances, and archive materials. Online conferences engage the issue of distant learning and teaching, the necessity to change teaching methods, both as a challenge and as a threat, and the abundance of digital educational environments already available long before classics was confronted by the recent need to make use of them. Elsewhere, at a conference discussing the teaching of ancient Greek drama in the digital age, I have argued that any provision, presentation, or demo of new or well-known scholarly resources by teachers should be accompanied by the offering of a toolkit that aims at creating the attitude and positioning the skills necessary for students to engage proactively with the wealth of study materials. In my view, formative assessment is well capable of encouraging students in the attitude that is wished for when facing the internet on your own, and determined to make the most of it. In my paper today, I will use the enhanced consciousness of the deceased, especially in early Greek epic, and the protagonist's handling of it, as a metaphor for today's virtual online space and students' successful engagement with it. First, a few introductory remarks on formative assessment as a teaching method before we turn to Homer on life and death. I will start from didactics and works towards an approach that better enables students to benefit from the high accessibility of materials and grow as a learner. The formative approach in teaching is not an entirely new one, of course. Over the past 20 years, two major educational reforms in the United Kingdom and the US have promoted what is now known as the formative assessment. In the United Kingdom, assessment for learning is focused on the interaction between the student and the teacher. The main aim of assessment for learning has been to stimulate learning processes like self-guidance, self-regulation, and motivation for learning. Over the years, many theoretical students have been published and quite a few based on empirical data. Unfortunately, the empirical studies all use different definitions for formative assessment, making a comparison difficult. The other educational reform promoting formative assessment is DBDM, data-based decision-making, a development that took place mainly in the US. DBDM features empirical research with stronger longitudinal designs, but its focus lies with standardized learning results and systems for monitoring students' progress. In other words, it does not concern itself so much with the learning process between student and teacher. DBDM processes largely take place outside the classroom. The formative approach combines some of the aspects of assessment for learning and DBDM, but adds a few crucial extra dimensions. Assessment from learning and DBDM, it copies the following presented under number 4. In addition, formative assessment combines these points to focus into a cyclic process of feedback and response. Its main focus is to contribute to the learning process through feedback and criticism, rather than to judge the outcome of the learning process. The latter approach, judging the outcome of the learning process, is known as summative. Summative feedback has its merits, of course, but it is rather poor when it comes to information, usually a mark expressed in a number, and it only appears after the student's performance and achievement. Thus, summative feedback is only loosely tied to the preceding teaching and learning process. The targets from formative assessment are regularly soon forgotten, as the student's learning process ends with and stops at the publication of the results. What follows summative assessment is usually a next step in knowledge acquisition rather than a revised step or the previous step taken twice. Formative assessment, on the other hand, is mainly used to provide data to further stimulate the learning process. The feedback provided by formative assessment may well start from a mark, but the mark is merely interpreted to enable the student to take the next, often a revised or repeated step. Formative feedback is hence richer than summative feedback. In addition, formative feedback is supplied at various steps in the learning process and meant to stimulate students' self-regulation. Hattie and Temperley and William describe formative assessment as a contribution to a process through a summary in 3 core questions. You will find the 3 core questions on the number 5 under the handout. DBDM would summarize a similar process in the steps presented under number 6, using slightly different terminology. What makes DBDM differ from Hattie and Temperley and William is that DBDM places emphasis on adaptations initiated by the teacher or the school, whereas Hattie and Temperley and William focus on students' actions and initiatives. In the study of classics, formative assessment preferably focuses on students' awareness of and reflection on their personal progress in the acquisition and interpretation of materials. Teachers' actions in the classroom as part of formative assessment are conveniently presented under number 7 and taken from Antonio and James 2014. The figure combines all the above mentioned core questions and steps and provide means that are necessary to link teachers' actions to students' activities. What it does not show is the cyclic movement of formative assessment that may better be represented under number 8 on the handout, a figure taken from Ruiz Primo 2016, under the title, the ESRU cycle. ESRU, as we can see on the number 8, stands for elicit, students, respond, recognize, use. This cycle, however, equally misses out on a very important aspect of formative assessment, if it is to help students focus on their learning objectives. The clarification of expectations, learning goals, and criteria for success. What will I, the student, learn? When will I be successful? What will I be able to show, do, or understand if I am successful? A full cycle, therefore, should be more like what is presented on the number 9 on the handout, and comprise of at least 5 rather than 4 steps. So far, formative approach has been a rather generic term, encompassing many different aspects of teaching, from the involvement of the teacher to the contribution of assessment to the learning trajectory. In order to get closer to a workable definition of formative approach that is beneficial for students' attitude towards the abundance of study materials, I will focus on the most important aim of formative approach: to elicit feedback and to use this feedback to take further steps in the learning trajectory and to clarify learning goals. In formative evaluation, feedback plays a central role in feed forward, as presented on the number 10, an answer to the question how to get there. As feedback is not the end or the conclusion, but merely a step in the process meant to encourage the next step, formative assessment is like the cook trying the soup. It is likely that the taste of the soup needs some adjustment, but you can only find out by trying. Such trial is useful when the cook is skilled enough to judge his own achievements so far, and willing and able to make adjustments when required and wished for. His or her feed up is the wish to create a delicious and satisfying taste. His/her feedback, the acknowledgement, possibly by others as well, that certain flavors are still weak, unbalanced, or missing. His/her feed forward is a rethinking of the recipe and its execution so far, and suggestions by others as well for further improvement. A summative assessment, on the other hand, resembles the customer enjoying the soup. Here the evaluation and judgment take place after the completion of the process. Rather than usual feedback, summative assessment elicits judgments that do not contribute to an improvement of what has been judged. In the virtual environment, classic students' feed up is the wish to make maximum use of the resources. The feedback is the acknowledgement that only very little is currently being used. For the feed forward, I will use the announced metaphor. What can we learn with regard to requirements needed to reach the goal from comparison of the modern virtual with antiquity's virtual world of the dead? Ancient Greek epic's most famous confrontation with the deceased Odyssey, Book 11, has variously been interpreted as a metaphor, either for the Odyssey's internal audience, the Phaeacians, who are supposedly to understand that their guest at their table disguises his 10-year absence from the known world as an otherworldly experience for their entertainment, or for the external audience, lest they consider Odysseus' delayed and rather challenging homecoming as the result of ordeals others than practically impossible and larger than life. Odysseus' visit to the netherworld has a clear function within the narrative as well, of course, to provide the hero with the necessary information to return to his native country, having been unable to escape the world of myth and fiction for a decade. Other instances of meeting the deceased in Homer have equally clear functions within the narrative, and as with Odysseus' encounter with Tiresias, they may suggest consequences that lie well outside the mythos of the epic itself. A case in point is Hector's artificially enhanced cognitive ability when he is about to die, mortally wounded, so de facto dead, by Achilles' spear, presented on the number 11 on the handout. The Iliad does not feature Achilles' death as predicted by Hector, but clearly Hector, as one nearly dead, possesses profound knowledge of the world of the living, as well as the ability to predict future events. Similar knowledge is showcased by the spirit of Patroclus, who appears in a dream to Achilles, a kind of unasked-for pop-up ability that Patroclus shares with other spirits of deceased that have not yet been buried, like Elpenor and the untimely deceased maidens and youths in Odyssey 11. Patroclus urges Achilles to make haste with the preparations for the burial, the more so since his spirit can see the immediate future, as presented on the number 12 on the handout. Again, the consequences predicted lie outside the scope of the Iliad. Compared to the last words of Hector's warning spirit, Patroclus' words are meant to influence the actions and the behavior of the living. Achilles is to heed these exhortations, even over his own grave. The higher level knowledge that Patroclus possesses due to his being deceased is actively being put to use to the supposed benefit of the speaker as well as the receiver, much like a modern push notification connected to websites and apps. The wish or the inescapable necessity to consult the dead requires the epic hero to surf the waves first and row his ship to the netherworld, itself clouded in fog and deprived of the light of the sun. Careful preparations are needed, digging a hole with a sword, pouring honey, wine and water, and sparkling wheat. The promise of a sacrifice upon return and an actual sacrifice on the spot, so that the animal's blood flows into the pit. Immediately, unwanted pop-ups appear with disturbing sounds. The epic hero can only resort to the burning of the offerings, additional prayers to the gods, and the wielding of an apparently useless sword. One pop-up, however, cannot be ignored. Among the unburied, Elpenor appears to beg Odysseus for a proper burial, number 13 on the handout, mixing enhanced knowledge with his request. Remarkably enough, a final pop-up cannot be addressed. The eidolon of Odysseus' mother Anticleia presents itself, but Odysseus fends her off in favor of the person he has been sent to consult, Tiresias, whose algorithmic advice we have already seen before on the number 2. Soon enough, though, Odysseus focuses on his mother again. As she has been buried, she needs to drink the blood first. Contrary to the pop-ups, consultation of the buried is controlled by Odysseus. His mother presents enhanced knowledge of the situation on Ithaca, but it looks like she merely describes her husband, daughter-in-law, and grandson as she left them recently, since she is apparently unaware of her son's misadventures. The series of heroines Odysseus consults next equally only presents knowledge from the past, itself sufficiently in demand, considering Persephone urging them on and Odysseus' enthusiasm to seize the opportunity to question them. Despite the single mention of interrogating them, only in line 234, Odysseus merely sees the spirits and delivers the catalogue from his own mortal memory. After an intermezzo, Odysseus encounters the spirit of Agamemnon, number 14 on the handout, who has clear knowledge of present-day Ithaca. Of his own son, however, Agamemnon is ignorant, as is Achilles, appearing next, of his and of his father. Both fish for information, but Odysseus is careful not to elaborate on what he does not know, number 15 on the handout, warned by his well-known but mistaken assumption about Achilles' comfortable position in the afterlife. The subsequent catalogue of evildoers and heroes of old presents common mythological knowledge with the exception of Heracles, who recognizes Odysseus and calls him by name, despite never having met him in person. Eager to meet even more heroes and quite unable to know when to stop, Odysseus is finally overwhelmed by the upcoming spirits and fears that his inability to control the tidal wave of potentially interesting spokespersons may result in one encounter too many, under number 16 on the handout. Better leave beforehand and retreat to the safe shores. Thus the brave adventurer returns, armed with the knowledge possessed by the dead, a knowledge that thus proves to be in demand, and, judging from Anticleia's encouragement to share it with his wife, generally meant to be further divulged. In many respects, the enhanced cognitive environment of the Odyssey's netherworld is reminiscent of today's virtual online space. The skills required to consult and interpret the knowledge of the deceased as displayed by Odysseus in his visit to the netherworld resemble those needed by students today, especially when they are encouraged and practically forced to resort to the virtual studying and learning environment. In order to be successful, students need to be competent in at least the following. 1. Surfing the waves, as it requires bravery to face the unknown. 2. Careful handling of hardware. One careless click may make you end up where you do not wish to be. 3. Answering pop-up questions first, Elpenor, even to the extent that you have to address your cookie settings time and again. 4. Resisting the constant diversion and distraction. Potentially highly interesting information requires your attention, but first things must come first. There is a question to be answered and vital information to be gathered before curiosity and personal preferences take the lead. 5. Assessment and evaluation of algorithmic information, and of course the need to fact check against an independent source. Fortunately, Searchy provides Odysseus with even more useful information upon his return to Ayaya, partly copying what Tiresias said, partly providing additional advice. Alas, most of what Odysseus has found out is not relevant or outdated. 6. Knowing when to go offline. Phishing is imminent, as is the threat of one click too many. As a teaching method, formative assessment based on students developing ability to use feedback as a feed-forward instrument aims to train these skills and attitudes, all most useful for those furthering their studies in the current COVID-19 circumstances. In post-Homeric literature, consulting the cognition of the dead remains popular, considering, for example, the appearance of Xerxes in Achilles' Persae, Socrates' foreknowledge in Phaedo, and Plato's error in Republic. As with all such experiences, a final warning for our students is in order, though, with regard to the Odyssey's netherworlds. Giving Agamemnon's misguided view of Odysseus' wife and of her dead suitor's view of her involvement in their killing, the final item on the handout, this warning echoes what our students should remember best. Be aware of fake news. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this inspireful lecture and metaphor. Yes, questions. We have a few more minutes.
If I may, I've spent some of the time recently with Book 11 of the Odyssey, and of course following it through Dante's Inferno and T.S. Eliot before getting to Le Guin. And really the worst sinners, I suppose, are those who were apathetic, the ones who, well, for Dante, but I think we see that I think in the encounter with Achilles in particular, but it's this idea of not being passionate about anything, about being devoid of desire, and I think that's probably one of the worst traps, I think, for our students. This trap of apathy, of not caring, and how do we deal with that? How do we avoid this trap of complete apathy?
Yes, I agree with you that is indeed a trap, and that our students face the risk of not only being overwhelmed by the enormous amount of study materials available and the accessibility of all these materials. I mean, there has never been a period in the history of scholarship, I think, in which so much material was so readily available for so many scholars, and our students may indeed retreat into some form of apathy when encountering this enormous mass of materials. So the first thing that we need to do, or that we need to strive for, is to invest them with a proactive attitude that will make them want to search for information, to find it, and to synthesize it into new wholes. And that is something else than for students merely to wait for us to present the materials that we happen to find interesting, or that we happen to stumble upon surfing the internet ourselves, or the library for that matter. And that is why I think, and that is why I advocate, that working on the attitude of students comes first, and the confrontation with all the materials only follows that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I found that especially when I'm trying to encourage them to search actively, when instead of feeding them a particular article I find interesting, and give them a variety of choices, they freeze. They even though they're let's say it's a British Library page with verified resources, so they don't have to go very far. They just have to choose which one to read, and they freeze, and they it seems to be counterproductive for some reason, instead of stimulating their interest, because I'm so excited about those sources and they're not, unfortunately.
True. It is indeed.
Yes, one more question.
I just wanted to add that I found as a high school student that always the hardest essays to write were when the teacher would say, write about anything you want.
Correct. Correct. Try start from your own point of view. Start somewhere and start searching. That is what most of our students find most difficult, or maybe frightening even.
Wonderful. Okay, I think we are up and we have to end our session, right? Lunch break is ahead of us. And so I would like to